Hello, welcome back to Journalism Media Week here at Leeds Trinity. I'm just with our next guest. My name's Paul Marsden, and he's the man with the golden touch, our next guest. After 15 years out of the Premier League, as soon as Graham Smyth pitched up at the YEP as the chief football correspondent, Leeds was straight up into the Premier League, romping away with the Championship last season. So I'm here today talking with him about Leeds United. Obviously, you had a bit of a late one last night, Graham. How are you doing this afternoon?
Yeah, not too bad. Just recovering from last night's defeat to Leicester City. Wasn't the best night for Leeds United, but still, as a game in the Premier League, and you can't really sniff at those opportunities.
And how are you finding the Premier League experience so far?
Football is brilliant. Some of the games have been instant classics. It's been really nice to see that Leeds United can compete with the same football that we all loved watching so much in the Championship, that it still works in the Premier League. But it's all played under this massive shadow of not having fans in the stadium, which has been something it's been surprising to me just how difficult it is to come to terms with that. It's still hanging in the air every time you go to a stadium. You sit down, there's no atmosphere. 2:45 comes, and I almost feel like I'm not prepared to report because I haven't switched on yet. Because normally at that time the crowd would be building, they'd be singing, and you'd be ready for a game. But you find that the players are walking out onto the pitch just before kickoff, and you haven't really engaged in the occasion yet. So, whilst the Premier League is brilliant and the football is great, the occasions are a little bit lacking compared with what they would have been.
Yeah, and how are you in general finding it in terms of being in that kind of COVID secure bubble in terms of covering football at the minute? Because obviously there's a lot more regulation involved than there normally would be, and it will, I'm guessing, be affecting quite what you're doing a considerable amount at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it starts really from pre-game. So previously we would have been up at Thorpe Arch on a Thursday, sat with Marcel Bielsa and his translator and probably a player as well to do our press conference. Though that obviously is a thing of the past now, and it's all done on Zoom, which I think sometimes it makes for a more difficult encounter for journalists. I think because of the awkwardness of video chats instead of being live with somebody and being able to maybe respond with follow-up questions, and it's more difficult. It's definitely more difficult in that sense. And then for games, we have to fill in medical questionnaires now 24 hours before the game and make sure we haven't come into contact with anyone with symptoms. And we have our temperature taken on the way into the game. We have to be masked the whole time. We have to socially distance from all the other reporters. And of course, previously the YEP would have sent 3 journalists to a game. We're now only able to send 1. It's 1 per organisation for the print titles at least. So the way in which we cover games has changed quite dramatically. And so now we have 2 reporters essentially covering it from TV, which is a vastly different experience. You miss so much of the things that go on the touchline or things that go on around the stadium. At Ellen Road, Victor Orda and his antics in the director's box are one of the highlights, really. And those kind of things, you have no idea that they're going on, really, when you're watching it on Sky. So our entire way of working, our workflow arrangements have all changed quite dramatically because of the COVID situation.
Yeah, and just before I go on, if there's any of you that are watching that want to ask Graham any questions as we go along, please feel free to pop them in the chat, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. But just building on that, I mean, obviously football had this break, this unprecedented spell where we didn't have any football going on, and then you've had this crazy period since, and in the last 6 months you've kind of had the restart of the Championship, the intense kind of schedule that happened at that point, Leeds getting promoted, then a summer transfer window, which has been unlike any summer transfer window before, and then straight into this Premier League campaign. I mean, how has it been for you professionally covering stuff like that?
I have to say I didn't relish lockdown when there was no football. That was really difficult because whilst we were able to cover all the conflicting self-interest statements that came out from each and every concerned party as to how we should finish the season and what the fairest mechanism would be in order to determine tables and promotions and relegations. We also had very little else that was fresh to talk about. We talked about the players and the fitness regime they were going through, but that became quite stale quite quickly. You could ask the players about how they were coping with lockdown, but the answers were all largely the same. They were experiencing lockdown just as we were. So we had to fall back on nostalgia, and sometimes there's the odd tactical feature you could do, perhaps, but it was a lean spell. It was like the longest ever international break, and I think most print journalists are not too fond of the international break. When you cover a club, when you're a beat writer anyway, because the players all go away, the club shuts down, and unless you're writing about Calvin Phillips playing for England, there's really not a lot going on to fill your paper with. So lockdown was really difficult. What happened after lockdown was a bit of a whirlwind, really. It was quite hard to take in and process just exactly what was happening. It was almost as if it was possibly going to happen. It was all in the balance, and then it all seemed to happen so quickly. Leeds getting promoted, it was wrapped up in a couple of days, and then we had the celebrations at the stadium, which were all very bittersweet. There's a lot of relief. It was a privilege and an honour to be there and to see Liam Cooper lift the trophy and Bielsa lift the trophy. That was a real highlight, a really nice moment. But then there were only a couple of thousand fans outside the stadium and setting off fireworks and getting to celebrate with the players when they went on that controversial open top bus, whereas the rest of the fan base weren't there. So it was a pretty bewildering period. And because we had so much content to produce, we did a range of supplements culminating in a special centenary season collector's item that we poured a lot of blood, sweat and tears into. Because we had so much work to do, you almost didn't have time to sit back and reflect on exactly what had just happened and what we'd just seen and reported on. And then we were straight into the transfer window and Leeds trying to gear up for a Premier League season. So there wasn't really a lot of time for reflection on just how significant a period that was. I've still not managed actually to sit and down and read from cover to cover all the supplements we produced, but they will be really nice keepsakes to have of a time that was just probably the most entertaining and most strangest period of my career to date.
And if I was going to ask you for a personal highlight of that period, what do you think it was? Was it the moment when they got up? Was it the moment when they signed Rodrigo? Was it them actually lifting the title? What do you think was the big point for you?
It's a good question. I was really pleased that Bielsa got involved in the celebrations. I think what I find really touching was that the footage of him joining the players at Ellen Road when they were on their way to Merry, I think it's safe to say. And he rocked up and had that great embrace with Calvin Phillips and Patrick Bamford. In the flesh, it was great to see the players cajole him into lifting the trophy and the kind of look on his face. He's not lifted many trophies in his career. He hasn't enjoyed a lot of success in the way that a lot of people judge success, trophies and titles and promotions. So to be there to see a world-renowned coach lifting a trophy and to see the look on his face, that was a nice moment. The press pack that were there on the night that they lifted the trophy, we all raced outside to see the players lifting the trophy again in front of the fans who were there. And that was an odd moment because there was a lot of controversy around that, and fans who stayed away and heeded the club's advice and club's pleas not to gather felt quite hurt, I think, and let down that had occurred. But the club very much felt that, having taken advice, if they hadn't have made some effort to show the fans who had gathered the trophy or give them something to celebrate, then they may well have stayed there all night until they got a glimpse of the players leaving. So they felt they had to do something. And in a way, I felt it was nice for the players that they had a moment, at least. It wasn't what they deserved and it wasn't what they wanted. Liam Cooper didn't have his pitch invasion. He didn't get carried around the pitch on the shoulders of fans as he would have dreamed of. But he did get that moment where, he could lock eyes with supporters, fellow Leeds supporters, and they could celebrate together. So it was great to cover that. And then, the transfer window was it was fascinating to see the strategy that we were initially briefed on kind of not, it didn't fall apart or it didn't fall away. It was just superseded by better and more exciting signings than I think anyone really thought would be available for Leeds United this summer. I think, with all of that said, producing supplements and actual print copies that people clamored for and that sold out, and the extra print runs we had to do, the fact that there was still life in print, that was really special for me, that people really wanted to get their hands on a newspaper. And, we kind of, a lot of people have moved past print and moved away from print and kind of consider it dead already. So it was really, really nice for me to see that people wanted those supplements that we'd put so much time and effort into, and seeing people kind of taking pictures and posting them on social media of all the different copies of the YEP they bought during that period, or saying that they hadn't been able to get one because they'd been to the shop and they'd all sold out. That was quite cool.
And how was it for you starting the job last summer, coming in to the environment that Leeds United obviously were in as a club, and obviously yourself taking over from Phil, who'd been doing the job for quite a long time? I mean, how did you find that experience of bedding into the role and the football you were covering?
I don't think I was quite prepared, and that's no fault of anyone at the YEP. I had plenty of warnings, if you want to call it that, or briefings. My second job interview was essentially an exercise for the group editor to really check if I really wanted the job and everything it entailed. And what he said to me that really stuck out was the pace, getting up to pace, finding that the speed at which you'd previously worked and existed would not cut it for the YEP as a daily, because I was going from a weekly paper as well to a daily. So the demands are so much higher and so much more intense, but also the audience is vast for Leeds United. I think I'm right in saying that the Leeds United audience for the YEP is the most profitable for JPI Media. It's certainly among the biggest audiences that we have as a company. And Leeds United supporters are absolutely rabid for every piece of news they can get. They sign a player, fans want to know who's next. An under 23s player isn't involved in the squad. They want to know, is he injured? What's the reason why he's not playing? They want to know why a player who hasn't been involved in Bielsa's plans for 18 months, what's going to happen with him next? Where is he? They want to know everything about their club. So the intensity of the role is a lot greater than the roles I had previously. But I feel like after a period of adjustment that you do start to bed in and you start to adapt. Something that Phil Hay said himself to me was that a lot of Twitter is brilliant. They're a great bunch, but some of the stuff you just have to let it wash over you or go over your head and just crack on with the job and sometimes ignore it and not be too led by Twitter. Because as engaging and entertaining as it can be, it's not the entire Leeds United fan base and it's not the entire YEP audience. We still have people who get their news from print. We have people who get their news from Facebook. We have people who get the news direct from the website, from News Now, from Google. So you can't be entirely swayed by a huge Twitter following and audience. And I think that was something that I kind of grew into rather than took on board straight away. At first, you kind of get a little bit lost in the fact that your Twitter account that previously had 3,500 followers had 24,000 24 hours later, which was, a bit mind blowing when your phone is no longer functioning because, the YEP have announced that you're getting the job, having not given you a heads up that this was about to be announced, and you've not had a chance to turn notifications off. My phone quite literally stopped functioning because the notifications were coming in so thick and fast. So that was an odd thing to have to deal with. But I feel like over the course of the year, I've been able to take on board a lot of the lessons that people gave me kind of before I took the role and realised just exactly what's required and start to get up to pace with what the YEP demands and what Leeds United fans demand.
And just because obviously we've got a lot of students here at Leeds Trinity who are really, really keen about breaking into sports journalism, how do you go about preparing for a job interview like the Leeds United reporter on the YEP? What do you kind of sit down and look at before you go into that? What are the things you're really wanting to impress on somebody?
Well, what they asked for was quite interesting, actually, because I expected to have to write something, but they wanted a video piece produced on Leeds United the season before. And of course, I'd been covering Chesterfield, and I think the only occasion I'd watched Leeds in the season before was a game against Norwich City, that was actually on in the press room at Chesterfield after a game I'd already covered, like an evening kickoff. I just hadn't had. I don't tend to follow a lot of football outside of the club I'm covering because to me there just isn't really the time, because you want to devote as much of your time as humanly possible to the club you're dedicated to. So I didn't know an awful lot about Leeds. I remembered Spygate because it was utterly compelling, even from far away. And I knew about Bielsa, and I knew that he changed Leeds. And everyone's aware of Leeds and the kind of struggles they've had and how big the club is, or at least you have an impression of how big it is until you first experience it. So what I wanted to do was create a video that showed I had done my research sufficiently to be able to talk about the season before. So I spoke to an analyst working at another championship club. I went on Y Scout. I looked at all the stats. I looked back through previous match reports about Leeds. I listened to podcasts that people had produced at the YEP and elsewhere about Leeds. Tried to give myself a broad overview of what Leeds United had done well and not done well the previous season. Looked at what they would need to do better if they wanted to go up and the questions that needed to be answered. Looked at the players that they needed to bring in, and then tried to put that video together. I also spoke to people who had been involved at Leeds over the years to get a grasp of what the fan base would be like and what the kind of expectations were. And then I spoke to other journalists who had experience of covering Leeds and working in and around the area. I had a friend at BBC Leeds that I was able to lean on for some help. I had a friend in broadcast who used to cover Leeds United who was a big help. So I just tried to get as big an overview as possible about Leeds United. And then I looked at the coverage of Leeds and tried to look for areas at the YEP that could be potential areas for growth.
Very good. So you're almost compiling your own dossier then to get in for the role. And with all due respect to obviously Chesterfield, who were playing in the National League, how different is it to covering obviously a very big club at that level to suddenly finding yourself at the top end of the Championship? I mean, how big a change was that in terms of both the football you were watching, but also everything that surrounds the game at that level?
Yeah, it was a big kind of leap. When I walked out into Bristol City Stadium on the opening day of last season, I think I tweeted, this isn't Boreham Wood, because my previous career, I started at a free newspaper in Stocksbridge, covering Stocksbridge Park Sales when Jamie Vardy was breaking into the first team. Then I went to cover Worksop Town during a period in which they took a 2-division voluntary relegation. So I was covering Northern Counties East League Premier Division football for a few years, and then Chesterfield, who were League One when I started and National League when I left. So my track record with clubs hadn't been particularly good until I came to Leeds. But I felt like I'd got a really good grasp of how the business of football works from being so close to those clubs and seeing what I felt was every possible event, from faked raffles at Chesterfield and players playing under false names for the reserves, and FA inquiries into betting allegations, fan protests. Worksop Town were kicked off the ground by the owner of the ground. It felt like I'd seen quite a bit. So I felt like I had a good grasp of what goes on in football, and I built up a fairly good list of contacts in the game. But it still didn't quite feel enough when I first started at Leeds. I still felt very much like the new boy at this level, and you need to take time to get to know the journalists covering other clubs in the division. You need to take time to get to know what the managers are like, that we're going to interview when they come to Elland Road, what other clubs are like, their styles. I've always found, though, that other journalists in my position at other papers or other media organisations are always very willing to help. And so before each game, if you make a call or drop an email into your counterpart at the other paper, they're always, 99.9% of the time, they're always a great help in giving you an insight into the club that's coming to Elland Road or the club that you're visiting at the weekend. And so you start to build up an understanding and appreciation of the division and what it's like. That's not to say it's easy and that's sufficient. You still a massive learning curve, but it's a really enjoyable one at the same time.
And during that learning curve, and as you've developed, how do you think the role of a sports journalist has shifted within the last 5 years or so?
Obviously, I think that media organisations would say that 5 years ago we were still trying to tell ourselves that we were digital first, but I'm not sure that's entirely true. I still think there's an element today that the newspaper, the printed version, still demands an awful lot of our time and dictates quite a bit of the working day. But we are definitely so much more digitally focused now. We're so much more focused on video content, and the different forms of content online that people like to consume their news and their sports news. I think it's changed a little bit in terms of being on the clock all the time. 5 years ago, you were still breaking news stories online, but I don't think there was quite it almost feels 24/7 at times with football, especially when you're covering a big club. It feels like news can break at any time and you almost have to be available anytime to deal with that. I think while ever we're producing papers, we'll still not be 100% digitally focused, but we have shifted a lot of our focus that way. And I think what we do now a lot more than we used to is look into the analytics of where our audience is coming from, what it is they really want to consume, the stories that capture their time and their imagination for longer, the stories that they're really not interested in. And then you have to balance that with the things that we feel duty bound to cover. If we want to say that we're covering every lick, spit and cough at Elland Road, we have to then do that. You probably wouldn't get a lot of engagement or a lot of page views from, for instance, a story I've just written, brief piece. Liam Cooper's been called up for Scotland's 3 games this month, which isn't great news for many Leeds fans because he's just back from an injury that he picked up with Scotland. And there's a lot of games, a lot of international games during this period. But you wouldn't get a huge audience on that story. But I still feel that story is worth reporting because he's the captain of Leeds United. And he's been called up for his country, and he's not had many caps before, and he's becoming an integral part of the Scotland setup. So I still feel that's important to note. I still feel it should be on our website. I still feel it warrants a mention in the paper. But as we can't ignore the fact that there are other stories that Leeds United fans might be more interested in.
I think we're gonna go to questions because by the sounds of it, we've got quite a lot building at the minute. Just before we go to that, Graham, I'm sure one of the questions that I'm going to get asked in a minute when they all come up on the screen is, so what is it like as a football journalist when you're covering a manager like Marcelo Bielsa and the kind of aura that he's created within English football and the amount of copy that he potentially generates around both his approach and also his interactions with other managers?
It is fascinating. It's challenging at times. Last season, it wasn't always easy because the quality of the translation wasn't spot on, because Marcelo has a very small circle that he trusts, and he didn't want a professional translator bringing in last season, so he used one of his coaches who did a phenomenal job for somebody who was not a professional linguist. But at times that, I would get messages on Twitter from South Americans who follow me because they're interested in Bielsa and they're obsessed with Bielsa, and they'd say, "Oh, Marcelo was mistranslated today," or "Your question didn't get translated quite properly, so the question he was actually answering was this." And so sometimes press conferences could be a little bit more fractious than I think they needed to be, because maybe the tone of a question we asked or the wording of the question came across a bit more brash or maybe a bit disrespectful when that certainly wasn't the intention. And sometimes his answers would be a little bit lost in translation. So there was a challenge there. He is very interesting. He sees the game so differently. The way he interacts and the way he manages the press is very different to anything I've encountered. I mean, I've come from covering Chesterfield, where Martin Allen would ring me on a Sunday night and would ask me my opinion about players that he was thinking of signing, and we'd have 45-minute discussions about how things were going at the club and which players were doing it and which weren't. He'd ring me on a Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. and he'd say, "Oh, what do you need for your paper?" And I'd say, "Well, whatever you can give me." And he'd give me 4 or 5 stories as he drove up to the ground. So that access was phenomenal for a print journalist. With Bielsa, it's all at a distance. Even before we were on Zoom, you don't get one-to-one access. You don't get to ring him. He's not going to ring you. You get your 2 questions in the pre-game presser and your 2 questions in the post-game presser, and that's the limit of your interactions with the manager in a week. So it is very, very different, and it can be very difficult. But what you can guarantee with Bielsa is that people will want to know what he has to say. The challenge can be coming up with the right questions, because there are questions, and you'll find this season, if you ever watch a Bielsa press conference, that there are national journalists who haven't had a lot of experience of asking Bielsa questions, that will ask questions that us who have been covering Leeds for a little while, we know that he won't play at. He'll play a straight bat. He'll say it's too early to talk about tendencies in the table. He'll say that it's too early to say that Leeds are, going to finish in the top half, or that Leeds are going to struggle. He'll not throw his players under the bus. He won't discuss refereeing performances. He won't discuss controversial decisions. He won't criticise the game's authorities. I don't want to say he's set in his ways, but there are issues that he just doesn't really touch. He feels like it's not his place to talk about. So you will waste your question, essentially, if you ask him about that. And there are things as well that he clearly doesn't really like talking about, or he gets wary of talking about. Like last season, Bamford versus Nketiah was the debate that came up constantly. And although there were times when we had to ask it because it felt like it was getting to a point where Nketiah needed to play, there were times when Bielsa was clearly very frustrated at being asked about it all the time. And yet sometimes those would be his best press conferences, because if he was a little bit irked by a subject, he would talk a lot to get his point across. And then he would give you reams of copy, and it was always fascinating stuff.
Very good. I can imagine Martin Allen to Bielsa would be quite a big differential. So I've got a first question here from Joshua. Obviously, reporting on the Premier League is working at the highest level and with the biggest names in sport. What advice would you give to someone trying to break into that field?
I think trying to break into covering the Premier League straight away as your first job is ambitious. I wouldn't say that it couldn't be done, because I'm sure there are unbelievably talented writers coming through and unbelievably talented digital journalists coming through that probably have a far greater grasp of where digital journalism is going than I would. My advice might be to find your niche and start doing the job before you have a job. If you can prove to an employer that you can produce good content already, then I think you've won half the battle. So if you do have a blog or an analytics Twitter account, or if you're producing a really great podcast that already has people listening, then you're not only just practicing and honing your technique, but you're building up a portfolio that can prove that you are actually already a journalist. You're just not employed yet. So whilst I wouldn't say set your sights low, I've always said to people, non-league clubs are crying out for volunteers for match reports or for videos, and some of them have very, very little resource in terms of media and press. So you will get opportunities at that level. And that also gives you a chance to build up a portfolio without maybe a huge audience, pecking over your every word and maybe bringing criticism that you're not quite ready to take yet. But I think any practice is good practice. So whatever the level you can find experience at, the more experience, the better.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about trying to hit the ceiling straight away. It's getting that experience in at whatever level to kind of then build on from there. Very good. And from Alessandro, how did you get your start, and how important were the contacts you made before you got going, and who were your contacts?
I got my start. I went to the University of Sheffield. One of the Leeds universities rejected me, actually. I'm not sure if it was you lot or someone else. I went to the University of Sheffield, and I had a massive interest in ice hockey at the time. I was a big Belfast Giants fan, and I wanted to go and watch the hockey for free in Sheffield. So I asked Hallam FM, local radio station, if they had anyone covering it, and they didn't. So they sent me along every week with a dictaphone or recorder, and I got to interview the Sheffield Steelers coach, whoever it was at the time, and just provide a bit of audio from every game. And I would write the odd time for the Steel Press student newspaper as well. And it was from doing that the local paper in Stocksbridge, I knew somebody who worked there, and I asked if they had any interest in ice hockey reports. And they said they'd like to carry an extra page of sport, so could I start submitting stuff? So I did that for free for about half a season. And then when they had a vacancy and I was available, they asked me just to fill in while they went through the interviewing process, gave me an interview at the end of it, and that's how I got the job. So it was by finding a niche that nobody else was really filling at the time. You know, there were very few people really interested in covering ice hockey, which was of the minor sports in Britain, was a fairly major sport at the time. Still quite a big audience for it, certainly in Sheffield. So I kind of got a bit lucky, but also I was willing to go and do 2-3 games a weekend and drive to Manchester, Nottingham, and Coventry to watch ice hockey, and that's how I got my start. I wouldn't say that I had many contacts before then. I find that contacts generally build up once you're in a job, but it's definitely useful to start making contacts as soon as possible with people that you think might be good people to know down the line.
Mm-hmm. Well, we did get Joe, so we got one of the two of you to start off with us at university, so that's good. And the next question is: when reporting on games, how analytical do you need to be?
Yeah, good question. Actually, our group editor, James Mitchinson, he was deputy editor of the Works Up Guardian when I went there as a sports reporter. And I remember him saying that, and this was probably 2008, 2009, I remember him saying, by the time the paper comes out, people know the score, they know who scored, they don't want a litany of facts and events. You want to make your match reports as colourful as possible. So I've kind of had that from that point. But because at the YEP, we call the match report the verdict, it comes out the next morning. We want it to be more the story and the context of the game, not so much exactly what happened. Now that can be a challenge on a midweek game. On a Friday, if we have an 8 p.m. kickoff, the paper deadline's 10:30. So the game finishes at 10. And bear in mind, Bielsa might be with you by 20 past 10 in the press conference. So you'll have 20 minutes to get your 1,000-word verdict to the subs so they can get it in the paper. So you might have to do a bit more of a runner that has, a colourful intro that you might have thought a little bit about before the game, but you don't often want to pre-write your intro because then you just know it's going to be completely rewritten by whatever happens in the game. But it might have to be a bit more of a colourful retelling of what happened in the game. But for a Saturday game, when the paper comes out on the Monday, there's no excuse really for not doing a really colourful and analytical piece. I don't tend to use too much in the way of the raw numbers and the data when it comes to our verdicts. I try and just tell a bit more of a story of why Leeds won, why they didn't win, and what the real story of the occasion was. But then during the week, or in the days after the game, we look at all the numbers and we try and look at the data, and we try and use that when we're doing our analytical pieces about players, for the midweek papers.
And I know you mentioned before, you were talking a bit about getting Y-Scout before you went for the job interview for Leeds. Do you think that's something that's become more prevalent among sports journalists now? They're going into all the material that exists in terms of being able to analyse bits and pieces.
Yeah, it's stuff that wasn't available before, and I know it's been available for a while. But when I was starting out, well, I mean, I don't think Wisecout covers the Evo Stick Northern Premier, but even in the Football League at that time, you wouldn't have had access to the level of data that you have now. And I think it's just a great resource. It can sometimes divide people, and some fans will always and forever return with the only stat that matters was the scoreline. And for those people, you're never really going to draw them in with a piece about expected goals or expected chances or expected assists. They don't want to know about key passes. They just want to know why we didn't win and is he going to drop Bamford or Hernandez or whoever. That's all they're interested in. There is a lot of people who are interested in the numbers. I think you've got to try and not just use the numbers though, but you've got to try and interpret the numbers and show why they're important or what they actually suggest, instead of just churning out reams of numbers with no real consequence to them. But there is so much of it available to you now that you'd be silly when you're trying to find content and you're trying to fill newspapers and you're trying to populate your website. It would be silly to not go down that route. So at the YEP now, we've got a stats channel. All stats aren't we. We've brought them on board to do a weekly preview piece that's a bit more analytical for us. We partner with LUFC Data quite a bit to look at the numbers behind players' individual performances, and we are trying to move towards using that material more often than we have in the past.
Very good. So it's constantly evolving then.
You have to.
And the question here from Saif, what skills would you class as essential for a sports journalist to succeed in the kind of role that you've got?
Be nosy. Don't be put off by somebody telling you there's not a story. If you can get your shorthand, get your shorthand. I still find it really, really valuable. There have been times when I've been stood in the queue for a ride at Legoland, or I was at Ponchford swimming pool watching my kid in a championship, when the phone rang with a story and there was simply no way of recording it digitally, and the only chance of getting the story down was with a pen and paper and with shorthand. So as much as we can rely on iPhones and recording Zoom calls, I still find that absolutely invaluable. And just being willing to talk to people. I find at Chesterfield that what helped at Chesterfield was that 3 months or so into my tenure there, we were banned by the club because they didn't like a series of articles we did on a dodgy, I think is the right word to use, football academy that was linked to the club. So we got banned, and I had to go and find the people who could give me information that the club were no longer willing to give me. And I find as well that that kind of person often wants to be found. They want to talk to journalists and they want to have clandestine conversations, if you will, off the record, and just gossip about what's going on. So sometimes there'll be fans who contact you, and it can be tempting in the busyness of the day to not really make the time to discuss football with supporters. But often supporters get to find out things that we don't, because they know people, they live in the city, or they live close to somebody, or they know somebody who works somewhere that's useful. So being willing to talk to everyone and anyone can often be a very helpful tactic.
And what's the most inconvenient time that anybody's ever sacked a manager when you've been covering a club?
Chesterfield sacked Danny Wilson on a Sunday morning when I was out somewhere with the kids. And when that's kind of you've done your work for the weekend, particularly as a weekly journalist, you've got your Saturday out the way. You thought that Sunday was your holy time for you and your family, and then you get a call saying Danny Wilson's getting the chop. Sports news doesn't really fit into a convenient lifestyle, and if you're looking for a 9 to 5, this isn't really the job for you at all.
And just got this question here from Jack. Having written so much about sports, what would you say separates a brilliant piece of writing from an average one?
A brilliant piece of writing engages with your emotions, I think. If you read something by Jonathan Liu, almost everything he writes, I think that's brilliant. The analogies he draws, or I mean, some of the full-time whistle match reporting he's done has been absolutely incredible, because it tells the story of what happened in such a brilliant and engaging way. that you get wrapped up in it again. You know, you're almost experiencing the match and the excitement of the match again. He for me is on another planet, and if I could get to halfway towards his planet, I would be a very happy man indeed. But I think any piece of writing that it has to inform, obviously, you have to tell people something, and it might be something they already know, but the way you tell it and how you interpret it, if you can elicit emotion from someone, then I always feel like I've done a good job if somebody feels something from something I've written.
Yeah, no, well, I remember Jonathan Liu piece. I think it was Liverpool Barcelona when they won that game 4-0. It was just ridiculous. You can't really file something like that on full time.
No.
But it's fantastic. So Ricardo wants to know, from the perspective of the publication, how do you think you could increase your readership beyond the regional borders? Do you think Leeds being amongst the top 6 in the table at the end of the league might perhaps help that?
I think there's an argument to say that you will have an audience potentially looking at Leeds United content who weren't really so bothered about it last season, because Leeds are now a contender or a competitor in their division. What you also have to remember with Leeds United is that Leeds United do not exist within a regional border. Leeds United are a club with a huge fan base worldwide. You know, the Scandinavian Supporters Club, you know, has 7,500 members, something ridiculous for a club that has been in the Championship for the last 16 years. So our audience, I wouldn't say is a Leeds audience. It's not a City audience, and we have to reflect that, and we have to try and engage and tune into the fact that we have Leeds fans in Dublin. You know, what was really interesting and encouraging for me was during lockdown. I think when it was obvious that a lot of industries were struggling and being hit by the COVID crisis, that we had people from Norway or from Ireland, Northern Ireland, around the world messaging and saying, how can we support the YEP? And that was before we brought in the subscription of the metered paywall. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me to not just think about talking about the city and the club making the city proud, because they don't just represent the city, they represent all those people who grew up as Leeds United supporters, because Leeds were the team that was on TV on the Match of the Day game on a Saturday at 3 p.m. in the 60s and 70s. You can't forget the global scale of the club, and that's something that I had no appreciation of before I took the role. You know, everyone says, "Oh, Leeds is a massive club." Players all say it when they arrive, but it's not until they actually start playing for Leeds. And I don't think Rodrigo and Rafinha and Diego Llorente, I don't think they'll realise how big Leeds United is until fans are back in the stadiums and they start to realise the sheer scale of it. But the global audience is something that the YEP, I think we try and tap into. We could probably do more to tap into that. But at the minute, Joe Urquhart, for example, is running a series of articles on Leeds fans worldwide, interviewing the fan clubs, you know, in New York and Adelaide and wherever else, because Leeds fans get everywhere.
Right, I'm being told that we're getting towards the end now, so I've really got to apologise for everybody who's been asking questions that we haven't quite got to. Really sorry about that, but thanks for the ones that we have had. Graham, it's been fantastic to talk to you, and brilliant to get that insight. And wish you the best for the season, however it pans out. But it's been great to get that insight. That was fantastic.
No problem. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks very much.